came across a study that was done by the World Bank together with the International Labour Organization called the Nomad Study that interviewed migrant workers returning from their destination countries in many corridors. And the brief of that study was to look at the cost of migration. And the economists who did that study interviewed or had interviewed many thousands of workers, asking them how much they paid for their recruitment, among many other issues. The principal objective of that study was really to look at not just how much they paid recruitment agents, but how long it took them to repay that, given that most of them took out loans in order to pay for the recruitment agencies. That went quite well, but they also tried to answer the question, why is it that some workers pay a certain amount and others pay a lot more, anything between $400 and $5,000, $6,000, $10,000. And so what were the elements or the variables in trying to understand why there was this considerable differentiation? It certainly wasn't based upon nationality, although that was one strong element. But in the end, they could not really answer the question. And I put it to them, I confronted them in different fora around the world, that they made an error in trying to work out the cost of migration based upon what workers pay. Whereas my argument is that it's not the cost of migration that they pay, that is the costs in being recruited, all the paperwork and so on, but rather it's what they are being charged by recruitment agencies. And I'm going to illustrate that for you in a moment. So the question arises, why are the prospective low-skilled, low-income migrant workers, I've used the word migrant workers here. I know that many people in this part of the world don't like the term migrant worker, but I'm using it simply in relation to the use of this phrase in international conventions. So why are these workers, particularly from Asian and African countries, required to pay when more highly skilled workers, professionals, don't pay anything? The labour economist argument to that is that it's because the low-skilled labour supply far outstrips the labour demand. So there is a labour market operating, and the laws of supply and demand explain what is happening. In other words, these workers, who are the poorest workers, have to compete with one another in order to get the limited jobs available. And so one way of doing that is for them to pay. However, this ignores a number of issues that I'm going to raise in a moment, but it ignores the fact that many employers actually refuse to pay the recruitment costs, and therefore the workers who are in a vulnerable situation and desperate for work find the money in order to pay those costs. Well, one of the issues that isn't really well understood in the recruitment process is that it's often thought that the manipulation, the exploitation of these workers occurs in the countries of origin, and principally with the private recruitment agencies. But really, it begins in the destination country, in my view. There is a structural, systemic process here. And when a company tenders for a project, one way to reduce the cost of their tender to be more competitive is to build in that they will not pay the recruitment costs for bringing their labour into the country. That increases their price competitiveness, and they do not have to, in this tendering process, they do not have to specify the costs of labour. Now, the worker pays model leads to market distortion. It means that workers are going to be selected not on the basis of their abilities, their trade qualifications, their skills, their experience, and so on, but also, and perhaps mainly, based upon their willingness to pay these costs. Some people call it fees, but I'll come to that in a moment. It also allows deception in the wage levels, allows for substitute contracts and playing around with food allowances, which I'll come to also. And because workers have to borrow money, even if they don't borrow it, if they use their savings or they borrow from family and friends, which is often the case, they're still going to be in debt in order to pay the money in order to get these jobs, which leads to what's called debt bondage or labour indebtedness, and that in itself leads to forced labour and trafficking and what some people call these days modern day slavery. It is because they cannot, once they've paid all this money, they cannot simply go home. They have to work even if they are not going to get the same salary they were promised or the conditions that they were promised. So the other element of workers paying is that it creates a certainty for employers who know that they're in debt and who can basically have much more control over the workers in their workforce. Because if they're in debt, they're less likely to leave. So it creates a certainty for them that the workers are not going to leave them. And it feeds corruption, and I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time on this because I think it's a particularly important issue that people need to understand. The idea of kickback payments. What are kickback payments? When a company wants to recruit migrant workers, they have to choose a private recruitment agency in the countries of origin. Now, this practice has been going on for decades now, so that the person who's going to choose which agency to give a contract to supply the labour, they will be given money by the recruitment agent for that labour supply contract. It's a bribe. Well, we can talk about it as a bribe or as extortion or exaction. It depends on who asks for the money. If the agent approaches the company and says, I'll give you this amount of money if you give me that contract, that's a bribe. If the company says, I will give you that contract if you give me some money, that's exaction. If there's a threat involved, then it's extortion. Okay, so I call this the structural culture of corruption in the recruitment industry because in countries of destination, the employer's expectation is that workers will pay. In countries of origin, the worker expectation is that they must pay in order to get that job. This is pretty standard in the countries that supply the Middle East. Asia from Philippines, Nepal, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and increasingly from African countries too, from Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Cameroon. Now, here's where we come across a little conundrum, which is the legislative mismatch. In 4 of the GCC countries, the labour law forbids workers to be charged anything for recruitment. So I did some calculations. I had the figures from that ledger for 2015, 2016, but I did not have all of 2017 at the time. So I just for 2015 and 16, we calculated with the cash payments and telegraphic transfer payments, if you add up the two items, food allowance and recruitment fee, that's 200 reals per month. Over 3 years of the contract, that's $2,000, which the employer is saving from that worker. And if you multiply that by 500 workers, that's a saving to the employer of $1 million, all of which have been taken from these low-skilled workers. I want to go on and talk about the kafala and to see what we have looked at, because I think that things have been missed in the general literature and scholarship on the kafala. The kafala now has a very bad name, charges of the kafala being equal to slavery and so on. And I think that what we want to do in this paper is to resurrect some moral and ethical issues that are part of the kafala system. Financial liability or debt, that's the kafala bil al-mal. It can be to guarantee the presence of a certain person, kafala bil al-nafs, or to guarantee the appearance of a certain person, as in the case of a lawsuit, and perhaps offer the bail for a person, for the delivery of goods, for the purchase of goods sold. These are the kinds of kafala and kafil that have been in place for hundreds of years. But nowhere in the past, until the modern, 20th century, was the kafala used or mentioned in relation to the employment of labour. This is something new, and we only really have the history from in the Arabian Gulf from the 1940s, principally in Kuwait, where there's been more documentation than anywhere else. But it was argued that it came as a cultural legacy rather than law. And it wasn't until 1975, with the Kuwait Alien Residency Law, that the kafala was spoken of in relation to migrant labour. So the kafala contracts were really used to protect the weak and the vulnerable by instituting the patronage of a prominent local who provided whatever protection was required, a form of community responsibility for financial, legal, or political representation. These forms of or applications of kafala can still function in contemporary times. On the other hand, investigating the technical usage and application of the classical Islamic kafala system, it is clear that an essential element of the classical system is that the kafala is considered a contract without benefits on the part of the guarantor. That is, the service of the guarantor, the kafil, is meant to be free of charge. And I'm quoting now from scholar Foster, nothing in the Ottoman or fiqh contexts referred to the use of such contracts for the purpose of rewarding the guarantor. Such a situation would in fact have constituted a legal breach, since any payments made to the guarantor for providing kafala would have constituted riba, forbidden in Islam. Now, what we see, of course, throughout the system is that the kafil, either directly or indirectly, is receiving benefits and profits from the employment of the makful. The current practice of the kafala system has been critiqued for its exploitation of immigrant workers to the extent of describing it as a slave system. It puts severe restrictions on labour mobility and has prevented the development of a local labour market. Kafils may withhold workers' payments while demanding longer hours and preventing access to legal rights by withholding workers' passports, contract substitution and the like. Kafils may also lease their kafala against payments. Workers may be forced to pay recruitment charges to the recruitment agency, thus burdening the workers with more expenses, feeding a system of bribery and corruption and binding them into a form of labour indebtedness and forced labour. There are many other forms of exploitation and malpractices of kafala and where the kafil profits that are against the law and indeed frowned upon from an Islamic perspective. In an answer to frequent questions on the Islamic legal framework of recruiting foreign workers through kafala in Saudi Arabia, the Permanent Committee of Scientific Research and Fatwas published a long research paper to provide legal reasoning for the legality of kafala and the parameters that should be considered in its application. The committee started its presentation by confirming that recruiting foreign workers is part of the state policy to care for the interests of its people. Consequently, the administration of labour recruitment is subject to the approval of the king as the head of the state and the one in charge of affairs of Muslims, that is, the Wali al-Amr. In addition to the sacred, binding and moral nature of the contract, Islamic law stipulates that the contractor should not have conditions that may result in deceiving one of the contract parties. In technical terms, a contract should not have gharar, such as a practice or condition that may cause a profit for one party, but a corresponding loss for another. Thus, one of the reasons why gharar should be eliminated is that its absence is a precondition for confirming the equilibrium in a contract. Contracts are never legally bound until the real equilibrium among the interests of contractors, the well-being of the community, and the will of the divine is ascertained. Thus, the kafala system can be Islamically reasoned and justified if it is framed in line with the rules of contracts as established in Islamic law. If there is a breach of these rules, jurists will argue against these malpractices. As an example, in certain instances, employers have used the system to hire workers, but to exploit them by asking them to work for another employer, provided that the worker pays him either a percentage of his earnings or a set amount of money each month. In other instances, the employer hires a worker with a certain wage, but once the workers arrive in the country, the arrangements are made for them to work for another company with a higher wage, and the kafil takes the difference into his own pocket. In both cases, muftis from the Saudi General Committee for Iftar and Research made the following comments. First, this form of contract contradicts the laws of the land as enacted by the Wali al-Amr to preserve rights, to maintain security, and to prevent problems. Second, it includes earning money in return for the kafala, that is, if it's not haram, it's at least a doubtful practice that Muslims are supposed to stay away from. A direct question from a kafil regarding the taking of money from the makful was put to the Saudi General Committee for Iftar and Research. It was in relation to employees who wanted to remain in the country, but they could no longer employ them. I quote, "I am the sponsor of a number of Afghani workers and have no work for them at the present time. Thus, they engage in other work in the country and live in my house without paying rent. They keep the money they gain from the work for themselves, whether it's a small or a large amount. However, they pay me 3,000 riyals for renewing their 2-year residence permit and referring to the concerned authorities. I have asked them to return to their country, but they have entreated me not to withhold their rizq. Am I sinful for this?" In addition to the fatwas the practice of sponsors profiting from selling work visas to workers abroad and not providing employment has come to be known as visa trading or free visas. And although widespread in the GCC over many decades, these practices are not condoned as a part of the kafala, but are strictly illegal, and perpetrators have been prosecuted, fined, and blacklisted. So we can see that the principle of the kafil not receiving anything from that position as a guarantor has been consistent even in the application of the kafala to migrant labour. Article 19 states that the kafil must be qualified to bear the obligations of the sponsorship as imposed by law and employ the expatriate under his own supervision. Provisions were also made distinguishing between the kafil kafil al-Iqama, the residency sponsor, and the kafil al-Khuruj, the exit sponsor, in case the residency sponsor was unavailable to sign off or deceased. In either case, the kafil, it was made clear, is responsible for any debts of the makful and to present a certificate from the authorised administrations that there is no claims or court decisions against him. The kafil's responsibility for the debts of the foreigner was thus quite clear and consistent with the traditional kafala requirement. Of course, in practice, it was most unlikely that the kafil would allow a situation where he would be required to pay the debts of the foreign makful. Indeed, it was precisely through the mechanism of the requirement of permission for an exit visa that allowed a sponsor to legally detain a foreigner when there was any form of dispute between them. And it might be noted here that the recent requirements of the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy, that oversees the construction for the World Cup for 2022, has now made it compulsory for employers to repay or to reimburse workers the money that they paid to recruitment agencies back in their home countries. And it would be interesting to speculate whether this is akin to the kafil paying the debts of the makful. To what extent this religious, moral, legal foundation of kafala is practiced on the ground offers a different question. Exploitation, fraud, and harm observed in the practice of modern forms of kafala go against the philosophy of Islamic contracts. It is therefore perhaps incumbent on critics of the contemporary application of kafala to invoke and address the nuances of those Islamic ethical principles that should still have resonance within contemporary economic arrangements in Muslim countries such as the Gulf states. In principle, until recently perhaps, the kafala as related to foreign labour maintained the principles that the kafil was responsible for the debts of the makful and was forbidden to profit from that position. Thus, the problem really has been the violations of these principles in practice rather than the kafala per se. And I guess that's a perennial issue when we are talking about ethics versus practice. And I think I'll stop there and thank you very much.
All that happened now was just that it was being abused now. I think this is not true. I think the truth is there was never any acceptance in Islam of controlling other people's lives. You know, the whole thing about Islam is we need to look at the purpose. You know, when Rabi' ibn Amir was asked, why did you come to Persia, you know, to fight this empire, and you are coming from the desert? He said, we came to liberate these people from being enslaved by their kings. So when I am a professional, I want to get married, I have to get permission from my sponsor in order to be able to get married. Or I want to buy a car, I have to go to my sponsor to get a car. Or I want to start a business, or I want to go to, That can never be in any way an abuse of an existing Islamic system. That is not related at all to Islamic practice. This system is a total innovation that relied on the fact that many people were not able to say no because of their weak position. The same thing is happening also for companies. Many companies, when they engage in a contractual relationship with the government, are subjected to conditions that they cannot say no to. Like in the US, for example, the law stipulates that the government, when they engage with the private sector in a contractual relationship, that there has to be reasonableness or a degree of fairness. Fairness has to be there. This is a legal requirement in contracts. So this doesn't exist here. So it is actually a whole philosophy. It's not about kafala. It applies to companies, it applies to individuals, it applies to... So it's not just about relationship with the kafil. It's the entire system is designed to support this because there is a gap and, this is filling it. This is my feeling, having lived here 55 years. If, for example...
Why did you stay so long?
Because my country, Palestine, was taken by other people.
I don't have any strong arguments against you. I mean, what I did here was taken extracts, but indeed it is a whole system, and it is a system put in place with the government for various reasons, and there are political and many aspects of control, but also favouring citizens over non-citizens and so on and so forth. Those kind of structural elements have been well documented. Yeah.
Mohammed? Thank you, Dr. for your talk. Dr. I just wanted to ask you, because it seems like a lot of the discussion has to do with government agencies and large institutions. What kind of talks or discussions do you have with people for workers to organize themselves? And is this a hard discussion to introduce when you're at the table with ministers or stuff? This type of thing of the community organizing themselves, the workers organizing themselves. Because I think there's always going to be you can say, a lack of movement and synergy when it's not from the people themselves. It's from other people who are above them or, authority over them.
That's a good question. First of all, there are strict laws with regard to unions in this country and other GCC countries, although trade unions in various forms do operate in some of the other GCC countries. Here, for example, the government, in particular the Supreme Committee for the World Cup, invited the Building Workers Union to play an overseeing role in the construction of the stadiums and so on and so forth. And the government passed legislation allowing for workers' committees to be established in companies where they could be elected. It's not clear to what extent those workers' committees can and will negotiate on issues such as wages and conditions, because it's too early to tell. But some companies have actually held those elections, and workers are going to get a voice in that way. Unions have been having a voice from outside through the International Labour Organization. The International Labour Organization is a tripartite organization. It only operates on a tripartite basis, which means government, employers and unions, and consults with all those three for everything it does, right? And so it was the trade union movement, was actually the representatives of the International Trade Union Confederation in the ILO that brought the complaint against Qatar, right? And it was the union movement that basically also agreed to drop those charges. So this is developing, but it's very early days, and I can't see any significant development of unions. By the way, there are different kinds of unions. The United States, for example, has more of an emphasis upon what we call enterprise unions, whereas in other countries, particularly with the British heritage, you have trade unions based upon the particular trade, or industry unions based upon particular industries. So here, with these committees, it's more likely to be an enterprise-type union, if you want to call it a union.
You informed us of the reforms that Qatar has done in terms of the infractions in the kafala system. Should we take those reforms as a normative position of Islam, or what Islam proposes in terms of solutions to some of the problems you talked about? Should we take the reforms made by Qatar as a normative position of Islam in dealing with the problem of kafala? That is the first question. The second one, looking at the whole kafala system, I don't know exactly where they started it from, but at least in the Quran, we can see in the story of Maryam, وَكَفَّلَهَا Maryam, Zakaria, where Zakaria took care of Maryam. And the word kafala is used in the Quran. But as it pertains in the contract, you could see that the kafil is going to work, and he has certain responsibilities that when the makful, certain things happen to him, he has to step in. But the system, it looks as if the system is not having anything for him per se, as if he is going to work and he is relegated to the background. Isn't that the reason why the kafil also finds a way of also getting something? Because if you look at the question, one of the, I think the fatwa, the question he asked about the workers, you could realize that the man has worked or is working within the whole system. But within the system, he is told that he doesn't have anything specifically from those workers.
Yes.
And he has responsibilities. So how does the system take care of those responsibilities? Isn't it a recipe for why sometimes some of this corruption also emanate? Thank you.
Thank you. Two very good questions, challenging ones. I don't think the reforms have been put in place from an Islamic perspective. I think quite the contrary. It's been a secular process that has been driven largely by tremendous pressure, external pressure on Qatar that is linked to the 2022 World Cup. There's no doubt about that, right? And the various organizations being very critical of Qatar, and its reputation became a big issue because of, at least partly because of the World Cup. And if you have a look at the way in which the Supreme Committee has been operating in making sure that every construction site and accommodation site, and making sure that all workers who are directly linked to construction for the World Cup are being fed and fed properly, which you have seen, right? I think that's a considerable degree the main motivations for reform. I haven't seen any articulation of Islamic principles in this reform process. Quite the contrary, it's become secularized. And in a way, that's the irony of what I was talking about with regard to the kafala. that it's no longer operative, or at least it's not invoked. We still have a sponsor, but with a different name, right? They've just abolished the exit visa, but with limitations, with exceptions. Domestic workers are not covered by the new exit visa law, right? And companies can have up to 5% of their workforce still under the old system where they require permission to leave the country. But employers are required to justify that. So there's a new thing. The Supreme Committee was very clever by saying, we want you to reimburse workers the money that they paid. How are they doing that? In a very unique way. They said, show us your accounts and show us where in your accounts that you have paid the recruitment costs. Most of them couldn't show that. So they're required to reimburse, which is, I think, a very interesting way to go about it. On your second, what happens when you commercialize certain social relationships? When you begin to introduce payment, whether it's for, organ transplants, for example, when it began with the idea of a gift, to not be commercialized, not be commodified. The same way, the kafil should be beyond reproach in order to fulfill that position as a guarantor for that person that they're going guarantor for, but for the community as a whole. And therefore, once you begin to allow a commercial or commodification of that relationship, you no longer have that position of trust and decency and goodness that is fundamentally moral and ethical, right? And that's why I think it was there in the first place and prefigured the British laws of trust by a long way. And I find that particularly interesting. And I think that's why, what is the role of the kafil in principle? That's what I think came from. But in practice, what you're suggesting actually happens. But I think it's an abuse of the purity of that position as it was intended in its origins.
Tamim?
Thank you very much, Doctor. In the headline or the title of the talk, there was a mention of supply and demand. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on the global order, so maybe taking a few steps back and commenting on the situation or the circumstances of the global order that lead to people wanting to leave or having to leave their country to do menial work in another country. The one that really gets me is mothers who leave their children to raise the children of other people just so that they could, provide for their own children materially. And do you think the conditions, whatever the conditions are they getting worse or are they actually getting better? Thanks.
I don't respond well to the broad questions, but yes, I mean, you said it yourself, and it depends what economic model you want to use for this idea of supply and demand particularly in migration, where you have push factors versus pull factors, where people in countries of origin are in dire circumstances. Many are really in very poor condition, high unemployment, and also high illiteracy rates and so on, and they need to find work. And if they can't find it in their own countries, they seek it abroad, and they will get assistance from their governments. Why? Because the countries that I mentioned before who supply labor to this region are in the business, from a governmental point of view, of exporting labor. It's an international market. Why? Because when workers go to other countries and earn 4, 5 times as much as what they would earn back home, and that is the case, even though we might consider the wages of these workers and domestic workers very low, it's far more than they would get back home. And what the governments now rely upon for their national accounts is the remittances. The largest source of foreign currency earnings comes from workers working abroad. And that is crucial for their gross national product, for example. But as I said, that's also countered by the fraudulent money leaving those countries. So, it decreases employment, decreases unemployment in countries of origin, increases the remittances, from which governments in the origin countries can raise international loans and so on and so forth. So it's very, very important to them. It's larger, the remittances in all of these countries is larger than foreign aid, foreign direct aid to those countries. So it's a double-edged issue, right? They serve a very important national function, financial function, to their countries of origin, even though the remittances have never been able to be harnessed by governments who would like to invest that money, because most of the money goes for everyday living for their families that they leave behind. As you said, their spouses and their children that they leave behind. But they are, on the whole, surviving far better because there's a member of the family abroad sending those levels of remittances to assist them. And that mainly goes for everyday expenses, for housing, and for education. They're the three key investments that workers make with the money that they send back home. But it's an ongoing issue. I mean, migration is, we don't really know the extent to which it's increasing or decreasing because of these flows aren't easily documented. There's a problem of data collection in migration flows and migration stocks. So we can't really, people make assessments of that, but they're not really based upon good data. So I think the principle is wherever people can make a better living, right, they will try to do so if they're prepared to leave their countries or have one member of their family leave the country and go abroad to assist them back home. But it is very difficult, to have domestic workers, for example, work as nannies to bring up children here in Qatar or in Lebanon or wherever, while their children are being looked after not by them, but not by their mother, but by their father, or by, more often, the mother of the woman who's working here.
Have you come across any studies on the outcome psychologically in those families for people who leave, if the mother leaves? And if you haven't, what was I know you've interviewed a lot of people. Did you pick up any feeling yourself or any anecdotal evidence about how it is for families when someone leaves in these circumstances?
There's been some research. Some research was looking at the change in the relationship within the marriage. For example, if the male has gone abroad, does that give the female, the wife and mother back home, more decision-making power in what happens in the country of origin within the family? And that is often the case. She is more empowered, and she receives the remittances, and she decides where it goes, even though if he might not disagree, he's a long way away, right? So those sorts of things are done, and indeed, there have been quite a few studies on women who are abroad, particularly for domestic workers, what happens to their families and their children back home. Quite often, there are many stories of the husbands finding another woman and children being relegated to grandparents more than the husband. And there are some very tragic cases. I remember once I was in Indonesia. I was invited there by a women's NGO, and they sent me up to a place called Cirebon up in northern Java to meet with women who had been domestic workers in the Gulf countries and had returned home, and they were to show me the bad cases, sad cases, and the successful cases. Some of the bad cases I saw were terrible, very tragic. And the one successful case was interesting. Her house was bigger than all the others in the street, was painted and more colourful. Her children were very well dressed. They were grown up now. And when she kind of retired and went home, she sent her 2 sons were now working in Korea and remitting money, right? So it went from generation to generation. And during the discussion, I asked her how often she returned home to see her children, her vacation. So she went home once a year, sometimes once every 2 years, for a month, sometimes 2 months. I said, well, so you really didn't see your children, you weren't really with your children when they were growing up. She was away for 20 years or more. And the success case, suddenly she stopped and she started crying. And she couldn't stop crying because I hit a nerve. So I was very sorry about that, but at the same time, it was very instructive that yes, she made an incredible sacrifice not to be with her children throughout their growing up in any significant way. So that's about all I can say on that.
Yes. Just one question. Don't you think that the real cause, like abolishing the kafala system, getting rid of all these costs for the workers, don't you think they're like band-aids? But the real problem is that the real problem can be cured by introducing a reasonable minimum wage, and that just probably cure like most of the problem. What's your take on like minimum wage?
No, I disagree. A minimum wage won't stop the corruption. It has really very little to do with the recruitment process. I mean, many governments of the countries of origin have minimum wages for their nationals, and it's up to employers to whether they accept those wage levels. For example, in the Philippines, a domestic worker is not allowed to leave the country unless she can show a contract that has $400 per month on it. But more often than not, they don't receive $400 in reality. So minimum wages won't stop the practice of agencies charging workers so that they can bribe the employers in the countries of destination to get those labour contracts. Well, there is currently a minimum wage in Qatar, which is 750 riyals, as you probably know. But at the same time, the government is working with the International Labour Organization to establish a more permanent minimum wage, which will be higher than that 750 riyals. But it's a very difficult process in establishing a minimum wage. How do you do that? It's quite complicated because of the conditions of workers here, where they get accommodation, they get food, transport. So what are their costs here? Or do you work out a minimum wage based upon the cost of living back in their home countries, which is where they send pretty much all of their wages? This is something that's being worked on now, but in the end it's going to be a political decision based upon an agreement between employers and the government and maybe the union movement abroad to set a wage. And I think that I've been advising giving those people my views on this as they're going around interviewing stakeholders for what should be a minimum wage. I think that they may come up, I hope they do come up with minimum wage that's not just one figure, because it depends on the conditions of the workers. Are they being given food? Are they being given a food allowance, or are they not being given food? The food is crucial, because you should have a different minimum wage rate for depending on what the circumstances of workers are. Anyway, that's their problem. It's a very difficult one. But I don't think it'll solve all the problems. Yes. Are you adjudicating, sir?
Sorry? No. So, I'm fine. Yes, please.
Another question about the approach. Regarding the historical dimension, you seem to have mentioned the law was 73 that introduced kafala. Because I remember when I was young, we didn't have any of these problems. It seems to me that it's not a legacy of the region.
No.
It's not something that existed here before. It is something that was introduced later on. So
Yeah.
how do you see? I mean, has there been any study sort of looking at the emergence of this system and the roots and how it was introduced? And because this was completely alien to Qatar. You know, I remember the people here before. We were like brothers. We were very free. People were. I think what's happening now is they're going back to their roots, to their, the good society that Qatar has always been in the early days. So
Yeah.
where did this come from?
Yeah, well, nobody really knows. And nobody really, I think, other than myself, has really studied deeply the recruitment process and these connections in a systematic way. But I think the general understanding is that it mostly began to develop with the financial crisis, when the financial crisis hit, or even later. So that the pressure of companies going bankrupt and the pressure of the competition for the business of recruiting foreign workers led to these practices. So that, for example, an employer wants to recruit workers. So agencies began to say, look, we will recruit workers for you at a lower wage than you are currently have in your workforce. So it began with convincing workers to take a cut, right, or to take contracts with lower wages. When that wasn't sufficient, they then would say, look, you don't have to pay for the recruitment costs. We will pay for the recruitment costs if you give us the contract to supply you with the labor, right? And from there it went to not only, it sounds like one of those people on television, not only will you not have to pay the recruitment costs, but we will pay you, right? So this competitiveness led to this system of corruption, so that all of which was because the workers in countries of origin were told, you want the job, this is what you have to pay. And so they were able to get that money to pay the personnel of the employing companies these bribes from the workers. And so then it just snowballed. Once that began to happen, then the employing companies could then tender without consideration for the costs of bringing the labour in, which then gave them a competitive edge in the tendering process. But that's the way it's being seen. And it might only have been in the last 2 decades, I think, probably at the most. So I think you're probably right, that it wasn't always like that, but the pressures of competition at a particular juncture forced or created these innovations, to put it nicely. And then, after that, it became structural. It became the norm that these practices continued. Because, and let's face it, the corruption has worked. It creates a stable workforce, and that's what a country like Qatar certainly wants, at least up until 2022. And most employers want a stable workforce. and the corruption where workers are paying gives that to them.
So what you're saying is that this innovation has nothing to do with the Islamic roots. It is a secular pressure and competition. And so
Yes, I think so, yeah. I would agree with that.
Any other question? Okay, the final word.
Final word. Well, I think that, despite your comments, I think that it's important to look at Islamic principles and Islamic ethics, whether you think they actually apply or not. I think one of the things that always struck me when I was in meetings with organizations, international organizations who have been critical of the Gulf states and maybe of Qatar in particular, that their critiques were always in secular terms, based upon international norms, international conventions, labor and human rights conventions. And it always struck me that there was never any mention of Islamic principles or Islamic norms or Islamic ethics. And they were, in my view, often very Orientalist and sometimes rather racist in their commentaries, which used to upset me and a few other people. And that's why I think that I wanted to move to try to introduce these principles to see what works and what doesn't. There's always, what is clear if we just look at Qatar itself, look at the law going back to 63, you have clear Islamic principles being invoked under the kafala. That has now changed. And maybe it's something we might lament in the future, but that's an interesting irony, I think, under these conditions, and that's why I wanted to do that. But the key thing for me is these kickback bribes. I consider them, the economists use euphemisms, various euphemisms for these kickback bribes. Let me give you a couple of them. Sometimes they call them facilitation costs, right? Or they call it leakage, or they call it seepage, or informal payments. And the latest one is hard to trace extra payments. I mean, it's like they cannot say what it really is. Why? Because they are not moralizing, and they do not want to moralize. They want to remain objective in some way that doesn't call out what it really is, and that is corruption. Bribery is a crime. And why isn't it being addressed as such? Partly because the evidence that I've shown you doesn't exist easily. Right? This is what I've shown you is a very rare documentation of the crime. And also because there's so much corruption and the vested interests, you can see the resistance against reforming this. If you have a multi-billion-dollar industry of these fraudulent payments, there's going to be resistance, right? So I think that the economists who just want to talk about the markets and indeed the maintenance of the markets, one of the economists from the World Bank study basically wants workers to continue to pay, maybe to reduce the costs and to provide what he calls incentives, the carrots, so to speak, for companies to act ethically. In my view, this doesn't work. It never works because the amount of money that is to be gained through workers paying is much too seductive to just drop it, right? This man that I showed you, who's getting $500,000 a year, he's not going to easily just drop that, right? With some kind of weak incentive, like tax credits or preferential treatment and for visas and so on and so forth. I believe that what really is necessary to bring this into more public, to the public domain, is the sticks, that is, prosecutions, high-profile prosecutions, which in itself will educate people that this is unacceptable behavior. I may be being fanciful, but I think that there aren't many people who are focusing upon this as much as me, and I think that it needs to be. The Sustainable Development Goals, the compact, the Global Compact for Migration, have included in them that workers should not be paying. So that it's there in the international fora, and it's being worked on now across the globe. The extent to which something is really going to change in this just remains to be seen. But if people aren't working against it, then it'll just go on as it is, to the detriment of the poorest, lowest skilled, lowest income workers around the world. That's my statement.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Ray, and thank you for everybody for listening and engaging. So we hope to see you again in the next lecture, inshallah.
Thank you very much.